Hello everybody, it's Jay Roby. Today we're going to be continuing on with our research into the dragon lines. Today we're going to be taking a look at the classical variation of the dragon. Of course, last video we took a look at the Yugoslav attack, but the classical variation is the second most common line that you'll find within the Sicilian dragon. So we're going to take a look at that today. Now, in terms of win percentages from the databases, white wins about 36% of the time, black wins about 29% of the time, and even though white is a little bit ahead in the win percentage, there's a very healthy draw percentage of 35. So as a black player, if you couple the 29 with the 35, you're looking at a very good solid defensive strategy to use within the dragon lines. So if white does get into the classical variation, you're going to have some options as black. So we're going to take a look at that today. So of course the Sicilian defense comes after white pushes his pawn up to e4, so the king's pawn opening, and black is going to push its pawn up now to c5, so we're into the Sicilian defense. Now pushing the pawn up to c5 of course is immediately attacking the d4 square, which prevents white from playing an immediate d4 without some kind of supporting piece backing it up. So from here white's going to develop its knight now to f3. Of course this knight is eyeballing up the d4 square. Black's going to push his pawn up now to d6, and white's going to thrust that pawn up now to d4. Now you might be asking yourself, well, why is white giving up a center pawn here for one of black's c pawns? And there's two answers to that question. Number one is space, and number two is opening up access for his dark square bishop. So of course black's best move in this position is just to go ahead and capture that pawn. White's going to recapture. Now black's going to develop its knight up now to f6. Now by doing so, it's also attacking the undefended pawn on e4. So white's most common response to this is to develop the knight now to c3 to defend that pawn, from which now black is going to push his pawn up now to g6. So that's a fundamental move that ushers in the dragon variation of the Sicilian defense. Now in the last video we took a look at, of course, white playing bishop to e3, which is the Yugoslav attack, which is currently the strongest response that white has against the dragon. So if you haven't seen that video yet, definitely go ahead and check that out. But in this video we're going to take a look at the second most common response that white plays in this position, and that's bishop to e2. So this is the classical variation of the dragon. Now from here, of course, black just wants to fianchetto that dark square bishop onto g7, and now white has two primary options in this position. One, of course, is just castle in this position. The other one is playing bishop to e3, and we're going to take a look at the bishop to e3 first. So white's going to play his bishop up to e3, and from here you have a couple options as black. The most played move in the position is castling, but recently through the database results and games have been being played by humans, and of course your computer engine analysis, a little bit of an edge is given to knight to c6 instead. So we're going to focus on knight to c6, which is a little bit stronger than a castle in this position. Namely, of course, we're developing a piece, so the knight's now perched onto c6. This is pressurizing the d4 square, and it's also giving the knight some options to jump to e5 or even b4 in the future, depending on how play follows. So from here, of course, white's going to castle. That's the most played move in the position, and from here black is going to castle from this position. So basically what we've done as black in this position is we've delayed castling one move to get that knight developed a little bit earlier to c6. It's not a substantial benefit to castling one move earlier, but it does have that little slight edge to it. So if you are the black player in this position, you might as well go with the stronger of the two options. From here now white has two big options. One, of course, is knight to b3, and the other is queen to d2. We're going to take a look at knight to b3 first. So white's going to swing the knight back to b3. Of course, this is giving the knight some jump options like a5 depending on how play follows. It's also opening up that d file a little bit, and from here black's best play is to bring the bishop up now to e6. So this is, of course, attacking the knight on b3. It's also allowing that bishop to maintain a little bit of control over that light square diagonal, carving towards white's king position. From here now white's best move is to push the pawn up now to f4, and we can see basically the plan for white here is to bring a whole lot of piece coordination to bear on the black position. Of course, we've got the pawns on the f and e file that can work together quite nicely. We have the bishops on e2 and e3, and of course we've got the queen and the rook on the d and f files that can work together quite quickly. Black's best response to this is to bring the queen over now to c8. So what this is doing is, of course, is backing up the light square bishop sitting on e6, and it's also putting a whole bunch of firepower now on the g4 square. And if white ever plays something like h3, there have been some games where black will sacrifice a bishop bishop, so it'll take the pawn on h3, and once white captures back with the pawn on g2, the queen will sweep into h3 and capture that pawn, and basically pry open access to that white king. But generally speaking, from this position, the most played move that white uses is king to h1, and from here now we're going to bring rook over to d8 as a black player. Now what this is doing, of course, is activating the rook, giving a little bit more pressure down on the d file, and of course black is still maintaining all that pressure on the g4 square. And in fact, from this position, it's pretty much equal. There's a very slight, minute edge that the computer gives to black in this position, but for all intents and purposes, it's dead on equal. But as a black player, you're going to have a really good game from this point. From this position here, let's just go back now to the castle. White also had the option to play queen to d2, which is another strong move in this position. And basically what that's doing, of course, is backing up the dark square bishop, preparing to bring that down to h6 if necessary, and basically trying to coordinate the pieces towards black's castle position. From here, black's best move in this position is now to swing the knight up now to g4. Of course, this is attacking that dark square bishop. We talked a little bit about how this can be kind of a cumbersome position to meet as white in the Yugoslav attack, but of course we're in a different structure here. So black can go ahead and do that now, attack that dark square bishop. White's most played move in this position is just to capture that knight by taking on g4. Black recaptures with the bishop, and now white thrusts his pawn up now to f4. So once again, we have that coordination of white's pieces. White's trying to make that a strength in its position. From here now, black can capture the knight now on d4. The dark square bishop, of course, will recapture, and from here now, black can thrust the pawn up now to e5. So this is going to prevent that e4 pawn from coming down. It's also attacking that dark square bishop. White will retreat that bishop now to e3, and then from here, black can take that pawn, and when white recaptures with the rook, black can bring the bishop back now to e6, and this is a dead equal position. So both players are doing fine in this position. There is no cutting edge for either side, but that's basically some move strategies that you can use to equalize the position as black, and you're going to have a good fighting game from this point forward. So let's go back now to the initial move, bishop to e2, and then after black fianchettos his bishop, we talked a little bit about how white had the option as well of just outright castling in this position, and that's what we're going to take a look at now. And interesting enough, once white castles, black is once again faced with the option to either castle or play his knight up to c6. So we have that option again as black. Now there is a little bit of a difference in this position. There is no slight edge to black playing knight to c6 in this position. In fact, in terms of positional strength, it's dead equal with a castle in this position. And in fact, you could even try bishop to d7 if you wanted to in this position. But since we're looking at the opening and trying to get kind of a consistent approach to it, in terms of like when you study an opening, there's so many options and so many alternative lines that you can look through that it can become mind-boggling. So what I'm going to do in this video is I'm actually going to stick with the knight to c6 line to kind of give you, if you're looking at getting a kind of a repertoire against the classical line in the dragon, if you're playing black and white is playing the classical against you, to try to get a little bit of consistency so that you can see similar positions, albeit a little bit different in each game, of course, but you can come up with some general plans on that. So I'm going to focus on the knight to c6 response here to the immediate castle. We're also going to take a look at a game quickly once I'm done covering these lines, and it's going to look at a castle in reply by black. But for now, let's stick with the knight to c6. So we're going to develop the knight up to c6 again. Once again, we're pressurizing the d4 square. We're also giving our knight options in the future, depending on how play follows. And from this position, white can play a knight to b3. Remember, we tucked the knight to b3 here in the other line. Also, maybe a little bit more sharp for white is to try something like bishop to e3. It's a little bit stronger in this position than playing the knight back to b3. And of course, this is giving that knight another defender here on d4. From here, black can castle, and now white can swing that knight back now to b3. So very similar position. In fact, if we flip back one move, another viable option for white in this position is to play once again queen to d2. So you should be able to see the similarities here between the other lines that we talked about when white plays an immediate bishop to e3. So anyway, let's go back to the knight to b3 move. So from here, what we're going to play as black is we're going to bring that bishop once again out to e6, attacking that knight on b3, and once again, just like last time, giving us access along this light square diagonal here still. White can thrust the pawn up now to f4, so once again trying to show that a coordination of pieces is going to be one of his positional trumps that he can use as the game progresses. And from here, once again, we're going to swing our queen over to c8, so once again pressurizing the g4 square. So very, very similar to what we talked about before. From here, the king can tuck into h1, and we can bring our bishop up now to g4. So this is a different option that we have at our disposal in this position. You remember last time we attacked the dark square bishop, but the position was a little bit different at that point. So here we're of course developing the light square bishop to g4. We're attacking the bishop on e2. White can reply by swinging its bishop back now to g1, so it's maintaining the dark square bishop, getting it out of the area of danger for possible future trades, and of course protecting the pawn on h2 a little bit farther. From here, black can swing the rook over now to b8. White can reply knight up to d4. And black can take the light square bishop now on e2, and when white recaptures, black can play queen up now to g4, attacking the queen there on e2. White probably won't want to trade the queens just yet, snug the queen there onto d2, and from here we can play a6, so we're taking away that jump point on b5 from those two knights, and from here now white can swing its rook over to d1. So very much an equal position again, but once again drawing upon that knight to c6 move. So let's go back here just after knight to b3. Let's move back one more move from there. Just like the last lines that we took a look at, white also can try queen to d2 in this position. And from here now, the position is a little bit going to change just a little bit here. We're just going to push to d5 immediately if white brings a queen to d2. White will, of course, capture that pawn. Black's going to retake now with the knight, so let's take a moment and talk a little bit about the position. So the knight is now perched on d5. It's attacking the dark square bishop on e3. It's also attacking the knight there on c3, and it's also opened up access for black's dark square bishop, which is attacking the knight here on d4. White's best response here is to take the knight now on c6, so that's attacking the queen. Black has to deal with that first before anything else. So he takes back with the pawn here on c6, defending that knight on d5. White can play rook over now to d1, so we've got a lot of attackers bearing down on that knight on d5 now. And now black can swing his queen over now to c7. White can continue by capturing. Black will recapture, and it does look like black drops a pawn here because white can come down and snag up that pawn, but black can reply bishop up now to e6, attacking the queen. When the queen falls back, black can trade the queens off and take the pawn now on b2. White can capture the pawn now on e7, but black has the nice move rook over to e8 to maintain an equal position. Because even though white was able to get the pawn a little bit earlier, as you can see here, that dark square bishop has to be saved, and of course black's light square bishop is eyeballing up the pawn here on a2, which is basically what's going to happen. So once the bishop peels back, black is going to take that pawn now on a2, and basically what results is you end up with two bishops versus, or two bishops and two rooks versus two bishops and two rooks. So very equal position. It's going to be an interesting game here. Of course, with perfect play, it's probably going to be a draw, but it's definitely a line that you can try to get work towards as black. And I think that the big theme here is that after white declares to you, if you're playing the Sicilian Dragon, after white says, okay, I want to get into the classical variation after bishop to e2, and you fianchetto, and then white has a couple big options at its disposal, primarily castling or bishop to e3. Those are by far the most played moves in the position. You'll be served quite well with knight to c6 against both of those options. But let's change gears now and get into the game that I want to cover. That's actually going to look at an early castle by black. So we're going to take a look at a game that took place in 2008 in the Olympiad, and it took place in Dresden, and the white player was Chung and the black player was Alfaro, and Alfaro was actually able to score a pretty decisive victory here, facing the classical line in the Sicilian Dragon. So let's get started from this position because all the moves up to here have been the same, except for now we're going to take a look at the castle here from white, and instead of playing knight to c6, which we talked about in the previous lines, black is just going to immediately castle in this position. So Alfaro has decided to castle. From here, play continues now. White brings the bishop up to e3. Black develops the knight now to c6, so very similar to what we've talked about before, just a slight variation in the move order. And from here now, white elects to go with the queen to d2 approach, so supporting that dark square bishop bearing down towards h6. From here, black continues now knight up to g4, so attacking that dark square bishop, which is a theme that we've looked at. And from here, white just elects to take that knight off the table. Black recaptures, and from here, white pushes the pawn up now to f3. So we're a slight different position here than we were before. So the f4 has not been played here by white later on. So instead, electing to kick that bishop. So the bishop falls back now to d7, good square for it. And from here, white takes the knight now on c6. Black recaptures with the pawn. Now let's just take a moment to take a look at the position here. We have a pretty solid pawn structure from black, and the knight sitting on c3 of white's doesn't really have a lot of great options to go to right now. Of course, d5 and b5 are both being taken away from that knight due to the pawn now on c6. So black has a very strong position to work from. From here, white decides to play bishop up now to d4, so he's attacking the dark square bishop. Black takes, of course, and he does so with check. White recaptures, and from here now, black plays his queen up now to b6. So you can see that black is trying to get the queens off the table. Of course, that queen on d4 is now pinned to the king, so white can either try to defend the queen, or it can just trade the queens off the table. White elects to take the queens off. Black recaptures, and once again, I want to point out the nice solid pawn structure here that black has to work with. And of course, white's pawns aren't too bad either. They're fairly solid as well, but the fundamental difference here so far in the position is now we're left to a knight versus a bishop and a couple rooks per side, and it's a fairly open position. This light square bishop sitting on d7 is going to be quite effective here for black as we move forward. So from this position now, white thrusts the pawn up now to a4. So this pawn, of course, has two defenders. It's got the knight and the rook, and from here, black decides to play rook up to a7, possibly considering bringing the rook over to a8 to double those rooks up. From here, white continues rook over now to d1. So this knight is still defending this pawn here on a4, so it doesn't have to worry about that for the short term. And black decides to play rook over now to b7, potentially thinking of pushing his own pawn up or handling any kind of pawn advance here from white. From this position, white does thrust that b pawn forward now to b4. Black responds by bringing that bishop now to e6, so giving it a little bit more of an active position. So before, of course, it was only kind of maintaining the diagonal from d7 to h3, but now sitting on e6, it's like a hawk perched ready for the attack, because now it's bearing down on both light square diagonals, giving it access to both sides of the board. So definitely a better position for the bishop. And it's worth noting that sometimes in positions, just a small subtle move like that can have some long-term strong results. So you don't always have to be pressing for an immediate attack. Sometimes it's just a matter of pressing into the position just a little bit better, looking for a piece that needs improvement and improving that piece's position. So when I first started chess, if I was to face this position, if I go back one move, I might have tried something like just immediately pushing my pawn up to b5, trying to mix things up and just to see what happens. But in this position, of course, black elects for a much better move in the position, just to simply improve a piece, improve the scope and the power of that piece. So I thought that was worth just taking a moment to mention. So from this position, white continues now by pushing the pawn to f4. Now, of course, we've taken a look at the f4 push earlier on in some of the lines that we looked at originally, but there's the big difference here is that a lot of pieces aren't on the table anymore. So we don't have the queens, we don't have a couple bishops, and of course the material's down substantially. So this move here from white isn't really a crushing threat that black has to meet. And in fact, from here, black just pushes his pawn now to f5, posing the question to white, what do you want to do with that pawn on e4? White elects to swing the rook over now to e1, bearing down on that e file, from which black captures that pawn. White recaptures with the rook, and now black snugs his bishop onto f5, so he's attacking the rook, and he's also eyeballing up that pawn sitting on c2. From here, white swings his rook over now to c4, so he's attacking an undefended pawn of black's, and black continues now by just pushing the pawn up now to b5, so he's attacking the rook, and he's also attacking the pawn on a4. Now white doesn't want this pawn to become a monster, so white just elects to take the pawn now on b5, black recaptures, and of course in the process he's attacking the rook there on c4. White peels the rook off now to d4, and from here now black takes that pawn up on c2, so that free pawn for the taking is just munched up there by that bishop. Now of course in the process the bishop's also attacking the rook on d1, so white has to do something about that. So Chung elects to lift his rook up now to d2, attacking the bishop, from which black replies bishop back to b3, and now Chung plays his rook over now to e2, attacking that pawn on e7, but of course the rook here on a7 is defending it still, but he might be able to drum up a way to get a couple of attackers on that pawn. That's going to be the ultimate goal that he's going to try here. From here now, bishop to c4 is played, and of course this is attacking the rook on e2, and the rook can't take this pawn yet, so the rook has to move to safety, and the rook moves now to e3, from which black replies now rook over to f8. From here, white now plays pawn up to h3, black hits a check now on a1, the king peels back to h2, black brings that rook back to a7 to defend that pawn on e7, and now white pushes the pawn up now to g4. So white's starting to storm these pawns down towards black's castle position. From here now, pawn up to h6 is played in preparation for this, and now white brings the king closer to the action by playing king up to g3, and now black plays king up to f7. And I want to take a moment to stop here. The reason that this king to f7 move is played is so it can defend that pawn on e7 and liberate the rook on a7 to get into the action. So a nice little move from black. So white replies now by continuing bringing the pawns closer to the king by playing pawn to h4, and from here black does now lift that rook up to a3, so a much more active position for the rook, way more active than sitting on a7, worried about the defense of the pawn here on e7. From this position, white replies knight over now to d5, so it's opening up access for his rook to attack the rook on a3. Black decides to trade the rooks off, captures the rook, the knight recaptures, and from here now black thrusts the pawn up to e5, attacking both the pawn on f4 and the rook on d4 in the process. White captures that pawn, black recaptures, and from here now the rook is actually moved over to e4, attacking the pawn here on e5. Black's response to this is to play the king up now to e6, so to defend that pawn on e5, from which white now takes the bishop on c4, black recaptures, and white snags up that pawn on c4. So in terms of material, we're equal, but we do have a passed pawn here on the e file for black, but we also have a passed pawn on the b file for white. So it's still an interesting position. From here now, black brings the king closer to the center of the board, so he's activating his king even more, plays the king to d5, attacking the rook on c4 in the process, and from here white brings the rook down, hits a check, and when the king peels off to d6, the rook slides over now to b5, so he's in front of the passed pawn. But from here now, black just simply pushes the pawn up now to e4. And if we take a look at the position, black's rook sitting on f8 is doing a wonderful job at keeping white's king from accessing the center of the board. So it's in firm control of the f file. More importantly, of course, we have the king sitting here on d6, and that's preventing the rook from getting behind the black pawn on e5. So white's got to be very careful in this position. White elects to hit the check here. Black moves the king over now to e5 behind the pawn. White snags up the pawn now on g6, and black just simply pushes his pawn even closer to promotion by placing the pawn now on e3. And the king, of course, is stopping that white rook from hitting any checks underneath it, and of course the rook cannot go to g5 to hit the check because the pawn will just capture it. Now white also can't play rook captures pawn in this position, because then black just pushes the pawn to e2, and it's going to promote no matter what white does. So it's definitely an interesting position. So from here now, white brings the rook down to g7, wants to get a check on that king, open up access to that pawn, and black now plays king over now to d6, so is protecting e7, d7, and c7 from the rook. The rook hits a check. King moves up now to d5, and now the rook goes back to g7, so it wants to be able to get some influence on that passed pawn that black has dangerously close to promotion. From here now, rook to e8 is played, so that rook is behind the passed pawn. This is going to allow the white king to get into the action a little bit here, but white elects to hit the check first with the rook on d7. king moves over now to c4, attacking the undefended pawn on b4, and white doesn't worry about that, just simply plays rook up now to d1. If black wants to capture that pawn, he can. Black doesn't do that, though. He just pushes the pawn up now to e2. So this pawn is a monster. It's one square away from promotion, and white's going to have to be super careful to hold the position. From here, white elects to put his rook in front of the pawn there on e1, and black just simply plays his king over now to d3. So he's not even worried about the b pawn at this point. Black, he's going to be able to bring all of his pieces into the action, and that's actually what happens as the game progresses. White tries to push the pawn to g5. Black just pushes its own pawn now to h5, not even worried about the g pawn coming down at this point. White pushes the g pawn anyway, but now black just slides his rook over now to g8. There's no way for white to defend that pawn. So white brings the rook over to a1, but at this point there's blood in the water. Black knows that and is just going to go and start ripping into the position. So he just captures the pawn now on g6, hits a check. King peels off to f2, trying to get desperately close to that pawn on e2 to prevent the promotion from taking place. But from here, black just hits a check. King is forced back, and now rook up now to f3 is played. White pushes the pawn now to b5. Black just simply brings the king back now to e4. Even better for black would have been to play the king up to d2. So if you want to take a look at that in your own engines, you can definitely go ahead and do that. But nonetheless, this is still winning for black. Now the rook comes back to e1, but black just simply snugs the king into e3 now. And what's white going to do? Well, white tries to place the rook back onto a1, threatening, of course, to get that rook into some checking positions. But take a look at this sequence of moves here. It's just beautiful. Alfaro hits a check on g3, and where's the king going to go? It only has two options in this position, h1 and h2. White elects for h2, but watch this. King to f2. Nothing that white can do from this position. The king, of course, is protected from any check sitting on f2. It's defending the rook on g3, and of course that pawn on e2 is just monstrous. It's going to be promoting very soon. White tries to salvage the position by playing rook over to a2 to pin that pawn down, but all black does is just slides the rook down to g4, keeping that white king tucked in, and now white's going to have to do something about that pawn, namely sacrifice the rook to prevent the promotion. Because after king over to h3, all black does is simply play king up now to f1, and that pawn is going to promote. And this is actually where the game ends. So it's just a great game to showcase some of black's options, playing in the Dragonline classical variation. Now, if you are interested, in the early castle as opposed to knight to c6, there are a couple line ideas from white that I want to draw attention to, just in case you decide to play down those lines instead. For example, if you do decide to castle on your seventh move, instead of bishop to e3, you might see something like bishop to g5. So how do you handle that as black? Well, it's a fairly simple way to handle it, actually. You just develop your knight to c6. So instead of playing knight to c6 first, of course, we castled. Now the bishop comes to g5. Now we bring the knight out to c6. And white has a couple move options here. Primarily, the most played move in the position is knight to b3, from which we're just going to simply play pawn up to a6. Taking away that jump point on b5 from the knight, also preventing the bishop from coming down to be a nuisance on the b5 square, and you'll have a fine game here as black. Alternatively, let's say your opponent does play bishop to e3, and it does follow the lines of the game. For example, knight to c6 is played, queen to d2, knight up here to g4, attacking the dark square bishop. Bishop takes, and from here, white has a lot of options in this position. In the game, of course, he elected for f3, but if we go back a move, you might actually see a variety of different moves here played from white, because there are a lot of different moves that have been tried. For example, h3 instead of pushing the pawn to f3. So what do you do if white plays h3 in this position? You just bring the bishop back to d7. White can try something like rook over to d1, and then from here you're going to have a fine game. Alternatively, after the bishop captures, instead of h3, you might see something like knight to d5 in this position, which is an interesting move. From here you can meet that with rook over to c8. White can try something like pushing the pawn up now to c4 to give that knight on d5 a defender, from which you can just bring your bishop back, and then from here white might try something like b3, but you're going to have a fine position to work from here as well. Alternatively, if we go back to the once the bishop captures, you might even see f5 f4 in this position instead of f3. And then here is the best response is just to bring that bishop back to d7 once again. Rook can come over to d1, and then you just reply rook over to c8. So hopefully that'll help you if you are interested in castling on the 7th move instead of playing knight to c6. But nonetheless, I hope you enjoyed the video. I know we covered a lot of material in this one, but I definitely enjoyed going over it, and I'm looking forward to continuing on with the Dragon series to wrap it up. Of course, I want to take a look at the accelerated Dragon and at least one or two other variations before we move on to the